For 5 years, I played a game of chess against a god. He lost, but I did not win. I will never forget him. The man in the bronze suede jacket, sitting on a grey wedge in St. John's Square at midnight. Revealed by the murky glow of a Victorian lamppost, the solitary figure leaned against the black wrought iron pole. He tickled his chin thoughtfully, whilst boring his keen eyes into a chessboard. As I staggered through the deserted London square, tipsy from a night out, I started grinning. The stranger was moving both the white and black pieces. There was something amusing and bemusing about watching him play against himself. Well, actually, it was the fact that he was playing against himself in the middle of London, at midnight. Still, if I'd been sober, I would have likely left the stranger alone and walked back to my inner-city apartment. I certainly would have taken note of the goosebumps which flooded my flesh. But on that particular night, my senses had been dampened by whiskey. "You lonely?" I called to the man. The dapper stranger paused, pinching a bishop between his thumb and index finger. He softly lifted his head, casting his gaze towards me, and then he smiled. Smiled in a way that was neither warm nor cold. It was mimicry, a learned expression, devoid of intent. "You've had a filling night, Declan," the stranger responded. The night was still, but a sudden breeze scraped my neck, chilling my core, and the yellow hue of the Seoul streetlight seemed to darken. How do you know my name?" I slurred. The man nodded silently at my checkered shirt, before returning his attention to the game he was playing. When I looked down, I released a sigh of relief. There, on my sweaty, unironed shirt, was a white sticker with my name scrawled barely legibly on the front. I remembered that my friends and I had started the night at a speed dating event, a humorous idea that ended in rejection, and sparked the decision to spend the rest of the night drowning our heartache. "Oh, right," I laughed. "So, are you winning?" The man smiled. "Very witty." "I try," I smugly replied, and then I sat at the other side of the board, swaying drunkenly as I studied it. The man should have been frustrated by my intrusion, and that may well have been so, but he did not show any sign of exasperation. He simply examined me with analytical eyes. "You play chess?" the stranger said. "Yeah," I nodded. "It wasn't a question," the man replied with a serrated edge. "Oh," I said. "Behind your blitzed eyes, I see a glimmer of understanding," he continued. "I always recognize a fellow player." I shrugged. "I joined the chess club at university. It's a fun game." "If you say so," the strange man replied. "Okay. Do you want to play against me?" I asked. The man shook his head, refusing to peel his sharp eyes away from my face as he moved a chess piece. I frowned. "Why not?" "You're not in a fit state," the man answered. I snorted, placing an index finger on my nose and lifting a leg. "I swear I've not had too much to drink, officer. Look, I'll do a dance." "I wasn't talking about liquor," the man whispered. "But you're not a child. I won't stop you. Do you really want to play? I do, I nodded, rubbing my hands. You think that, he said, resetting the board. But we shouldn't tempt fate, Declan. Right. What's your name? I asked. Cato, he replied. Feel free to start. Are you sure you want me to be white? I asked. It'll give me an advantage. I'm sure, Cato said. Alright. Have you got a timer? I hiccuped. The man shook his head. No, I wasn't rushing you, Declan. I like a long game. Don't you? I shrugged again, and Cato smiled. Let's say we each have 365 days per turn. I laughed hysterically. Right. Untimed chess. Sure. I like a casual game. No, Declan. 1 year. That is the time limit per turn, the man insisted. If I hadn't been so tipsy, I might have noted the sincerity of his tone. But I saw Cato as a typical British man, loaded to the brim with deadpan humour, offering unwavering politeness towards an inebriated fool. Okay, Cato, I hiccuped again. A timed game. I don't plan on using a year per turn, though. I've got work in the morning. I opened with the move that most chess players make when playing as white. Pawn to e4. Control the centre of the board, my drunken brain told me. Cato responded with a pawn to e5, which I'd expected, and I moved my knight to f3. Steady, Declan, the man warned. You have so much time. Is this a race to you? I raised an eyebrow. Huh? We're in the opening stages. What is there to consider? There's no harm in contemplating, the man replied. Why squander opportunities? You might miss something. I shivered at the man's odd demeanour. I don't know, man. I want to go home before sunrise. Cato nodded, and he replied with a pawn to d6. Though he seemed to be handing the centre of the board on a platter, the man was still playing defensively. I inhaled and carefully inspected his position. I remembered an old chess friend telling me that one should expect defeat when approaching a stranger with a chessboard. But liquor fueled my hubris. I moved a pawn to d4, preparing to sacrifice my first piece. Cato sighed. Oh, Declan. He responded with the bishop to g4, which surprised me. Again, if I'd been sober, then I'd have known that he wouldn't accept such an obvious bait. And I faced my first predicament. If I were to move my knight to safety, I'd lose my queen. I knew which piece I'd rather sacrifice. So, I moved my pawn to e5, taking Cato's pawn, and the man shook his head, replying in the obvious way. He moved his bishop to f3, taking my knight. That didn't faze me. I was about to take his bishop. In my eyes, that was a strong trade. I seized the crown of the queen between my fingers and prepared to drag her across the board. But Cato's hand shot forwards at an inhuman pace. Horror filled my mind as his deceptively strong fingers snatched my wrist, paralysing me before I made my move. "Let's take a break, Declan," the man said. I grinned. "Do you resign already?" He shook his head. "No, but we should take a second to heal." "It's already late, pal," I said. "I don't want to be playing for hours, I just want to—" "Declan!" a voice shouted. I twisted my head and saw two figures stumbling into the square. Matty and Franklin, my closest friends. Drunkards in arms from that evening's pub crawl. "Where the heck did you go, Deck?" Franklin asked, laughing. "Home," I answered. "I hate to tell you this, but you didn't make it." Matty snorted. "You said you were going for a leak," Franklin said. "How did you end up here?" I realised I had said that. In my intoxicated stupor, however, I'd somehow forgotten what I was doing, and ended up wandering off. I pointed at the chessboard. "Oh, I found a guy. Started a game of chess." Matty and Franklin both put their hands on their knees and started wheezing uncontrollably. This is why, Declan," Matty spluttered, wiping tears from his eyes. "This type of antic is why we didn't get lucky at speed dating." "It's time to go home," Franklin said, wandering over to me. But I'm playing chess," I insisted. "You should listen to your friends," Cato warned. "I will be here tomorrow, and every day after that. I'm always here from the midpoint of the night." "So I win?" I smirked, as Franklin hoisted me up. Cato shook his head. "I'm not resigning, Declan. I'll see you soon. You need time to think about your next move." "Whatever," I snorted, believing that would be the last time I'd ever see the man. "Come on," Franklin sighed, leading me over to Matty. "Let's get you two home." Franklin had always been the level-headed member of the trio, the sturdy beam that balanced Matty and me. The three of us had been friends since childhood. Matty and I turned to Franklin whenever we needed help, guidance, insight. Even on such a boisterous night, the man remained calm and discerning. The saviour who rescued me from the strange man in St. John's Square. If only he'd arrived before I agreed to play that game. "Which way is my house, guys?" Matty mumbled as we reached the junction. That way," I confidently said, pointing right. Franklin sighed, grabbing my arm and pointing it to the left. Right, I meant that way," I slurred. Matty laughed. "Hey, Franklin, I love you, man." "Yeah, I sometimes love you guys too," Franklin replied, rolling his eyes. "I'm just trying to get you both home in one piece. So let's—" "I love you, Franklin," I added. "Are you two parrots or something?" He laughed. I drunkenly wrapped my arm around our leader's shoulder. "Seriously, man, that guy might have sold my kidneys on the black market by now if you hadn't stepped into the fray." Matty giggled. "He looks really sad to see you go, Deck. You've pulled." "He had a weird energy," Franklin said. "You'd think, at 28, that you'd be old enough to know not to talk to strangers, Deck. You know it..." A hooded figure suddenly charged into us, bumping into Franklin's back, and my friend stopped mid-sentence. The assaulter and his accomplice fled, whilst Matty and I drunkenly yelled at them. but Franklin said nothing. "What is wrong with kids?" I asked. Franklin? Are you..." My friend's eyes welled with tears, and he turned to face me. When Franklin opened his mouth to speak, it was not words that tumbled free, but blood. I screamed as the liquid drenched the chin of my terrified friend, who was choking as he fought to say something. And then Matty screamed, eyeing Franklin's back. "The kid stuck him with something," he cried hoarsely. The two of us quickly sobered up, supporting Franklin as his legs buckled. When I caught him, I grabbed his coat and felt the tool protruding from his lower back. Not a kitchen knife or a sizable blade, but a stone hatchet. A medieval instrument of torture that did not put my friend out of his misery swiftly. Instead, Matty and I endured the horror of Franklin's agonizingly slow death. He passed before paramedics arrived. The following year was hellish. Franklin was gone. A boy we'd known for more than 20 years. Matty and I had each other, but we were aimless without our compass, our voice of reason. And I dreamt often of his ghastly dying eyes. Eyes of the boy who always spoke words of wisdom. Reduced, in his final moments, to a frightened lamb, whose mouth spilled nothing but innards. And towards the end of the year, tragedy struck again. My mother developed lung cancer. Years of smoking had caught her. She had tried to kick the habit, but addiction is a plague. "There is a way forwards," Dr. Brown told me. "A pneumonectomy. That would involve removing your mother's cancerous lung. If the condition hasn't spread, then surgery may significantly lengthen her life." "Brilliant. So why don't we do that?" I asked. Dr. Brown sighed. "Your mother doesn't want surgery, Declan. I've tried to convince her. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm the best in the business. I've told her that. She doesn't care." "She doesn't care about much anymore," I said. "But I'll talk to her. Thank you, Doctor. You've been amazing over the past few weeks." "And so have you," Dr. Brown said, patting my back as we walked to Mum's room. "Yeah, she's lucky to have you. I'm sure your mother will wake from her afternoon nap soon. You should sit with her for a little while." And I did. Sat for so long that I shed every drop of water from my tear ducts. "She's getting worse," a man said. I jolted as a familiar wave of air washed across my neck. And when I twisted around, my jaw dropped. In the doorway to the hospital room, the man with the suede jacket stood, a briefcase hugging his side. What? Get out! Get out of this room!" I ordered. "Don't you remember me?" Cato asked. "Yes," I snapped. "That was months ago. Are you following me?" "No," he answered. "I was just wondering whether you were planning on making your move." What?" I gasped. "As you might be able to see, I'm a little preoccupied." "That doesn't matter," Cato replied. "You may ignore the game, but it continues. It cannot be stopped until it ends." "Leave before I call security," I warned. "I won't ask again." "I'm sorry for your loss, Declan," the man nodded, turning to leave. Loss! I barked tearfully. My mother isn't dead. She's sick. I wasn't talking about her, Cato whispered, turning to face me again. And his eyes were suddenly clear, clearer than they had been on that first night, finally visible to my sober gaze. Eyes without colour or humanity. Eyes without any physicality, if such a thing makes sense. Dread lit my own eyes like a set of high beams. What do you mean? I whispered fearfully. You know what I mean, Cato smiled. I'm sorry about your friend, Declan. The overhead light burst, leaving only the lamp to illuminate that cramped hospital room. I didn't have the courage to be furious at the man for his insensitive comments. I was too frightened of his aura. Cato didn't know Franklin. He didn't know me, but his comments suggested otherwise. Who was he? She doesn't have long, the stranger continued. But you want to fix her, don't you? My eyes filled with tears, and I spoke, shared my soul with the man, for some reason that I didn't quite understand. Dr. Brown told me that a surgery would prolong her life, I croaked. Cancer has taken her left lung. And what's the real issue, Declan? Cato pressed. Mum doesn't want the treatment. She hasn't wanted to live for a long time. She hasn't, the man whispered. But we always have options, Declan. The man finally crossed the threshold, entering Mum's room, and I didn't protest. I wasn't worried about her waking to see a strange man in the room. I had the awful feeling that things would always go as the stranger had planned. Cato opened the briefcase, and it revealed a chessboard with the pieces of our game from 10 months earlier. He placed the board neatly on the coffee table and sat opposite me. I stared blankly at the pieces. Pieces that had inexplicably remained in perfect positions whilst the briefcase was closed. But I was too horrified and riddled with grief to question that. My mind was always incapacitated, to some degree, whenever I faced the terrifying man with the chessboard. It's your turn, Declan, Cato said. You still have 48 days to make your move, of course. But time really does seem to be of the essence, doesn't it? My colour drained as I eyed the petrifying face of my opponent, a man who no longer looked human to me. I knew that I had to keep playing. It was inescapable. And I made the move that I'd planned many months earlier. Queen to f3. I took Cato's bishop. Still not learnt the value of patience, I see. Decisions require thought, Declan. The man moved his pawn to e5 and took mine. I was simply striving to end the game as quickly as possible. End it and rid myself of Cato forever. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Aren't you going to take a look? The man asked, offering a grin of pure malice. I shook my head. You keep making it clear that you want me to focus on the game. I keep making it clear that you must be patient, he said. You have time. Look at your phone, Declan. I huffed, but my jaw fell when I opened the message. It was a text from Matty. His sister had been hit by a car. There was no other way, Declan, Cato said. You had to lose the pawn. Sacrifices must always be made. Leave, I whimpered. This time, Cato did not protest as he had done in St. John's Square. He nodded and stood. You know where to find me, he said. Hopefully, next time, you will be smart enough to not make me come looking for you. Less than a minute after Cato left the room, whilst I messaged Matty, a feeble voice sounded from behind me. I love you, Declan, my mum wheezed. I looked up and smiled. Hi, Mum. Had a good sleep? She nodded. Yeah, beauty sleep. How do I look? Better than ever, I chuckled, sliding over to her and holding her hand. I've been thinking, Declan. It's not my time, she said. I'll tell the doctor that I want to do it. My eyes widened. You mean... She nodded. Yes, I'll do the surgery. We tightly embraced, and the surgery, which took place less than a week later, was successful. The cancerous lung was removed. I thanked Dr. Brown, the hero who had given my mother another chance at life. To this day, I view his charisma as the driving force behind convincing my mum to accept the surgery. However, a cold part of me knows that more sinister forces were at work. Several weeks later, I was wandering past St. John's Square on a Saturday afternoon. The grey wedge was packed with eager chess players. No Cato in sight, but I was reminded of him. Black thoughts infected my head as I recalled the strange series of coincidences I'd witnessed over the prior year. But I dismissed it. I was ready to move on with my life, move on from him. Every time that man was out of sight, he was out of mind. And I didn't see Cato until the end of the following year, after the hospital revealed that Mother's cancer had spread to her remaining lung. The specialists missed it, and they were running out of options. Chemotherapy was Dr. Brown's next suggestion, but my mother was adamantly opposed to that. I didn't blame her, of course. Chemotherapy is an unpleasant thought, regardless of a person's mental state. I didn't want to push my mother to accept the treatment, but a selfish part of me hoped that she'd agree. I wasn't ready for her to go. We'd made huge strides in terms of her depression, dealing with the grief of losing Dad 5 years earlier. Mum and I had been seeing Rebecca Lowe, a psychiatrist who helped both of us. It seemed I also had hurdles to overcome. Lowe helped us to accept that, whilst we did not know how much time my mother had left, we knew that we had the present, and we should cherish that. We have to stop meeting like this, Cato hissed. I didn't jump in fright. I sank in fright. I'd expected to hear the man's voice in the doorway to the hospital room, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. No matter how many foreboding signs I saw and tried to ignore, that spectral presence always induced terror. I'll play, I said, unprompted. The man smiled. Good. You're starting to understand. Cato unloaded the chessboard, and I prepared to make my move. But for the first time in 2 years, I really thought. This was no longer a game. I no longer felt able to dismiss the horrible events as coincidences. I had buried my head for another year like a fool, refusing to believe the impossible truth. The fates of my loved ones were tied to the game. I tentatively moved my bishop to c4, bracing for another painful loss. Cato responded by moving his knight to f6, and I calmed my breathing. We then sat for several hours in silence. I considered my options. Daylight approached, and my mother stirred. The horrifying man understood that he should leave before she woke. Very good, Declan. Patience. You're learning. I will be in the square, Cato said, packing up his board. At the midpoint. I nodded, and I barely moved for the rest of the day. My employer allowed me to take the time off, but I spent hours thinking only of my position in the game. I was barely present as my mum chattered away, and then I slipped out of the hospital when she fell asleep. I arrived at St. John's Square around 10 in the evening. It took a while for the late-night partygoers to disperse. They reminded me of my friendship group 2 years prior. I thought of how much had changed in such a short time. Around midnight, Cato arrived and silently unpacked his board before sitting opposite me on the grey bench. I immediately moved my queen to b3. Interesting, the man said. Make your move, I snarled. The man's eyes glistened for a moment, as if a cloud of rage had descended upon his mind, clouding any compassion that may have resided there. And he firmly pushed his queen to e7. My heart pumped in my throat as I started to dread the horror and havoc that his strongest piece might wreak. But I didn't need time to think. I saw what I believed to be a good move. I pushed my knight to c3, and Cato replied with a pawn to c6, biding his time. The sickness in my body eased, but the fearful flutter in my chest persisted. Still, Black's position looked weak to my eyes. What am I missing? Is he toying with me? I wondered. Cato's poker face felt so sturdy, so conniving. I was terrified by the prospect of what his cursed game might take from me. I had to strike the jugular. I moved my bishop to g5, setting my sights on the king. It was time to stop thinking of what I might lose. Instead, I sought to win. And I'd trapped his knight. If he were to move it, his queen would be vulnerable. The man's options were limited. Quite good, Cato nodded. Not for you, I said. No, not for me, he admitted. But not as good for you as you believe. Cato moved a pawn to b5, threatening my bishop, and the terror of the situation gnawed at my mind once more. I realised, even if I were to win, I would have to lose more pieces. And I wouldn't just be losing ivory figurines. So impatient, Cato sighed. Take your time. Assess your position. Think. The longer I take to think, the longer you have to think, I said. You don't know how I work, he whispered, smiling horribly. I hardly wanted to move, But I had to move. There was no avoiding the game. It had to be played. I only had control over how I played it. I moved my knight to b5, taking Cato's pawn, and I fearfully eyed the pawn that threatened my knight. "Sacrifice, Declan," Cato whispered. "It is inevitable." The stranger took my knight by moving his pawn to b5. I felt a pang in my gut, and I knew what was coming. We waited for an hour. I trembled, and Cato smiled. A sinister statue, viewing me with haunting eyes. I suspected the nature of the call before I answered.
"Declan?"
My mother sniffled. "Are you okay, Mum?" I whispered.
Yes, Oh, Declan, it's awful.
She sobbed.
A nurse just told me that Dr. Brown died on the hospital floor. A heart attack, she said.
"I'm so sorry, Mum," I whimpered. "I'll be right there."
Matty's sister, and now this. What a dreadful time.
My mum said. Cato did not speak as I left, and I did not summon the courage to return to the square for 6 months. "I was worried," the man said, as I joined him under the lamppost. "About what?" I asked. "That you might not, in fact, understand," Cato answered. "I don't understand," I shuddered. "I don't understand any of this." "There is no rhyme or reason to my will," he smiled wickedly. "The sooner you surrender yourself to that fact, the sooner you may enjoy the remainder of your journey." My will. Those 2 words told me what I'd suspected for 2.5 years. The awful truth of the situation. "What are you?" I queried in fright. "Time is ticking, Declan," Cato replied. I moved my bishop to b5, taking the man's threatening pawn, and the godlike horror responded by moving his knight to d7. At that point, far later than I had planned, I finally castled. I had a suspicion that I was my king. I had to protect him. Cato, on the other hand, could not castle in his position, but he did the closest thing. He moved his rook to d8. His king was well defended at all sides, and I realised that winning would require an excruciating journey. Sacrifice. A pathway had formed in my mind. I just wasn't ready to take it. "If I stop playing," I started, "what happens?" Cato raised an eyebrow. "You run out of time." "Yes," I nodded. "In a year. But what would happen? Would my loved ones die anyway? Those near and dear to me? Or would I die instead, sparing them?" Cato smiled. "You haven't learnt, have you? You still hope to cheat fate." "Just tell me!" I shouted. In response, the lights of London disappeared. I choked in terror, my voice abandoning me as I was left in a soundless state of stillness, and the man eyed me with that ever terrible smile. "The game does not stop until it ends," Cato said. "You've said that before. What does it mean?" I cried. "Win, lose, or draw," he whispered. "Those are the only options. What happens if I resign? I asked. Do I die? Yes, the man answered. The first blunt answer he had given. Think, Declan, he continued, before I had the opportunity to end the game. What happens to an army without its king? Well, that is for the opposing side to decide. And I'm not sure that I would let a single piece survive. There are no shortcuts in this game. Hand shaking, realizing that sacrificing myself would achieve nothing, I made the only move I saw, the only move that I hoped would open a passage to victory. I slid my rook to d7, taking Cato's knight. And the man responded, as I had expected, by moving his rook to d7, taking mine. I whimpered in fear, not knowing what horror awaited me. Take the knight off, Cato whispered. He packed up, and then he walked into the blackness. As the lights of London resurrected, no sign of the man remained. I did not receive immediate news, but that only led to a steadily growing sense of fear in my mind. Awful anticipation. And when Matty didn't show for our weekly session at the pub a few days later, anticipation turned into a horrifying realization. I rushed to my friend's apartment and banged on the door viciously. Repeatedly, but there came no response. It was the middle-aged neighbour who eventually emerged in a pink dressing gown, miniature dachshund yapping at her heels. "You a friend of Matthew?" the woman grumbled. Yeah, I nervously replied, knocking for the 20th time in 2 minutes. "Rent was due on Friday," she huffed. "It's Monday. He isn't answering his phone or opening the door. I'm tempted to go inside." Tears started to sting my eyes, and I found myself saying something I really didn't want to say. "Get the keys," I said. The woman's eyes enlarged. Well, I'm the landlady, but it's not really appropriate for..." "Please," I said. "Something's happened to him. We need to get inside." After a little bit of hesitation, the woman eventually buckled under the pressure of my agitated disposition. She was likely grateful for any excuse to enter the home of her tenant, and hopefully retrieve her owed money. But neither of us found what we wanted. Matty's bare body lay in the bathroom, dry blood staining the toilet seat and his bludgeoned temple. His legs were draped over the edge of the bath, and the shower curtain had fallen from its hooks. I cradled my friend's body and sobbed whilst the landlady dialed 999. The official investigation produced an uncontested explanation. It was an accident. Matthew slipped and fell. "It happens," I was coldly told. "The problem, Declan, is that you're trying to control the world," Rebecca told me in a therapy session. "I am so sorry. You have faced too many tragedies for one person, but you will never be able to stop bad things from happening. There is only one thing you control. How you react to these things. How you choose to move forwards." When I finally returned to St. John's Square, many months later, I knew exactly what moves I still had to make. I knew exactly how it would end. I just didn't know whether I had sufficient courage. Either sacrifice a few, or sacrifice them all, I reminded myself. There is no other way. I moved my remaining rook to d1. Cato moved his queen to e6, and I took a deep breath as I moved my bishop to d7. The dreaded d7, a square that seemed to be the source of such horror. Is this becoming easy for you, Declan? The man asked, chuckling. Sacrificing pieces for the greater good. Make your move, I tearfully demanded. Cato smiled, moving his knight to d7 and taking my bishop. I'll spare you the terrifying wait. I didn't take time to recover. I sat and waited for the revelation. 6 hours later, after the sun had risen and people had filled St. John's Square, Mum called.
I don't know how to say this,
she bawled.
What is happening, Declan? These past few years have been... Oh, it's just... A patient became violent and... Rebecca Lowe passed away earlier this morning, Declan.
I was silent for a minute or so whilst my mum calmed down.
Are you okay?
She eventually asked, weeping gently. It'll be over soon, Mum, I whispered. I just have to finish something.
What? Declan,
I hung up the phone before she finished her sentence. Always in a rush, Cato tutted. You are a monster, I said, and I hope you rot in hell. There is no heaven or hell for the wind, he said. I am the natural passage of things, and I pray you have learned to stop fighting me. I'm hoping you've seen... I've seen it, I hissed, breaking into tears. Yes, I saw a way of putting a cap on the nightmare. All I had to do was move my queen to b8. It would be check, and if Cato were to take my queen, I would move my rook to d8. That would be checkmate. If he were to take my queen. You have escaped fate for years, the man said. It is time. I won't do it, I replied. I got up and fled into the crowd, hearing Cato's booming voice atop the raucous early morning commuters. You can't run forever! He laughed horribly. No, but I could run for a while, and that was what I did. I devoted my time and love to the one person I had left. Mum. I drained the clock down to the last few days. Spent a year by her side. I'm in so much pain, she whimpered. I love you, Mum, I sobbed. I love you too, my mother replied, grabbing my hand. I'm sorry these past few years have been so... terrible. It's okay, I cried. I just don't want to lose you too. We've known this day was coming for years. She croaked, coughing. No, I can delay it a little longer, I whispered. You know, I've seen him in the doorway, Mum whispered frightfully. Death. Not with a black cloak and a sceptre, but a brown jacket and a case. That thing has been waiting for me, waiting a long time. I wonder whether you've been holding on too tightly, Declan. My heart plummeted, and my mum smiled. Don't cry, she continued. You're allowed to let go, Dec. And I say this for you, not me. I'm ready to see whatever lies beyond this world, though that may be nothing at all. I don't want to see you living in pain any longer. Will you do it? Will you finally say goodbye? I lowered my head, and we sobbed together. It took a long while for me to nod. Goodbye, Mum, I bawled. I love you. When I arrived at St. John's Square, around 2 a.m, the man was patiently awaiting my arrival. He did not quip, did not smile, did not even look at me. His eyes were fixed upon the board, the game that was panning out as he had always planned. Some part of my terrified soul knew that. I seated myself and stared at my queen. Stared until the sun rose. Stared until the square filled with people. Some gathered around us. I will leave soon, Cato whispered, at the midpoint of the day. Should we reconvene at... No, I blubbered. Just give me... I need... Why did you take the others, Cato? I knew Mum didn't have long, but the others had full lives ahead of them. There is no rhyme or reason to my will. He chuckled maliciously, before repeating what I'd said. Make the move. I pushed my queen to b8. Check, I croaked. He's gonna do it. An onlooker started to chatter excitably with his friend. Oh, yeah, that's smart. Seeing what I'd seen, but he was unaware of the situation's ghastly gravity. Unaware of the petrifying consequence which approached. And Cato made, of course, the only move he could make in that situation. Knight to b8. He took my queen. Tears trickling down my cheeks, much to the alarm of the onlookers, I shakily waddled my rook across the board, placing it on d8. Checkmate, I wailed. Oh, God. The onlookers offered a round of applause, and Cato extended a hand. Congratulations, Declan, he said, still smiling malevolently. Live your life well. Do not fight it. It takes what it wants. The man laughed erratically as he stood, and the onlookers became increasingly concerned as I sobbed profusely. The mysterious stranger disappeared into the crowd, but I still fear that he may return. He may wait for me to rebuild my life before suggesting another game of chess. And he was right. What would I be able to do in such a situation? There is no stopping a game with Cato. Not until it ends.